Okay. Let's get started. Hello and welcome. I'm Maris Kreisman, and I'm so thrilled to welcome you tonight to another excellent virtual event at McNally Jackson. If you go to mcnallyjackson.com and look at our events calendar, you'll see all the amazing writers and programs we're hosting in the coming weeks. So please keep an eye on the site or subscribe to our newsletter to hear more about what's coming up soon. We're so glad that even though we can't all be in the same room at the moment, we're still able to host events during this difficult time. As we've weathered the pandemic and reopened all 4 of our locations for browsing and shopping, indie bookstores like ours still need more support. And so if you enjoy free events like this one and want us to keep hosting more of them, please buy books from us. Throughout the evening, I'll post links in the chat to buy the Book of Difficult Fruit from McNally Jackson, as well as Amy's books, The Drunken Botanist, and Wicked Plants. I'm so thrilled to introduce to you tonight to 2 wonderful writers who write about language and food so brilliantly. Kate Lebo is the author of the cookbook Pie School and the poetry chapbook 7 Prayers to Kathy McMorris Rogers, and is the co-editor with Samuel Ligon of Pie and Whiskey, Writers Under the Influence of Butter and Booze. Her essay about listening through hearing loss, The Loud Proof Room, originally appeared in New England Review and was anthologized in the Best American Essays 2015. She lives in Spokane, Washington, where she is an apprentice cheesemaker to Laura Lee Misterly of Wait, I'm gonna say this right, Kate. Quillisasket Farm.
Got it.
And Amy Stewart is here. She's the best-selling New York Times bestselling author of the Cop Sisters series, which are based on the true story of one of America's first female deputy sheriffs and her 2 rambunctious sisters. Her popular nonfiction titles include The Drunken Botanist, Wicked Plants, and Flower Confidential. Her books have sold over 1 million copies worldwide and have been translated into 17 languages. She lives in Portland with her husband, Scott Brown, a rare book dealer who can usually be found at his shop, Downtown Brown Books. So nice to welcome you both, and I'll turn it over to you, Kate, for a little reading.
All right, unmuted. Thank you so much, Maris. I will not push that button again, I promise. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate, Amy, your close read and your encouragement with this book so much, and your introduction of me to your own readers. That is amazing. I'm also really, really grateful to be reading with McNally Jackson. So the Book of Difficult Fruit looks like this. It is a collection of essays that go from A to Z, aronia to zucchini, where I use unusual and unruly fruit to tell stories where what nurtures and what harms are all tangled up. So one of the images I had before me as I was writing was a blackberry briar, so something that is both thorny and sweet. I'm going to read you a really short excerpt. This is an excerpt from Harper's. I just discovered that today. I was paging through, finished with the easy chair, got to the readings and saw my own name and just about fell out of my chair. So this is from my cherry chapter. My mother's sister died of breast cancer when she was 34 and I was 8. I thought she'd caught the disease from eating maraschino cherries, a belief no one corrected because I never said it out loud. Eventually, in time that passed too quietly or too gradually to notice, I stopped believing she died from processed food. At no time did I stop eating maraschino cherries. This was, in a way, like smoking would be later, an abstract poison whose intake, because it had not yet killed me, made me immortal. The story is often told this way. The maraschino cherry, as we know it, was invented at Oregon State University during Prohibition to garnish virgin cocktails. Real maraschino cherries were historically a Croatian delicacy made from marasca cherries, a sour variety that's still grown and prized today. True maraschino liqueur is distilled from marascas and their crushed pits, then combined with cane syrup and aged. Imitation maraschinos have been made in the United States since the turn of the 20th century with a variety of non-alcoholic brines. In the 1920s, East Coast maraschino manufacturers ignored the Queen Anne cherries grown in Oregon and Washington because they went to mush when prepared. Enter OSU's Cherry Whiz. After years of experiments, the professor Ernest Wiegand discovered that adding calcium salts to cherry brine kept the cherries plump. After 1940, the FDA decided it was lawful to call imitation non-alcoholic maraschino cherries just plain maraschino cherries. By then, US consumers assumed that maraschinos were, as they are described by the FDA today, cherries which had been dyed red, impregnated with sugar, and flavored with oil of bitter almonds or similar flavor. In the United States, the bitter almond oil needed to make maraschinos is usually derived from apricot kernels, not bitter almonds, unless the flavor is produced synthetically in a lab. True bitter almonds have higher concentrations of the chemical that creates the flavor, amygdalin, than apricot pits do, but bitter almonds are harder to find and illegal to sell in the United States because of their toxicity. A bottle labeled pure bitter almond oil bought stateside is likely made from apricots. The pits of cherries, plums, and peaches contain amygdalin too, though in smaller concentrations, which means their almond flavor is not as strong. It remains common for cherry pie recipes to recommend a teaspoon of pure, real, or imitation almond extract to gesture at the bittersweet flavor of cherry pits without risking their potential poison. Amygdalin is perhaps better known as laetrile or B17, a notorious quack cure for cancer. At no time did my aunt consider amygdalin a possible cure, though evidence-based medicine didn't save her either. Labeling food toxicity is a tricky business. One argument made during a third round of cocktails by an employee of an international fruit company to which I once sold my image, voice, and recipes is that this company, which might otherwise support legislation for GMO labeling, was against it for fear that labels would also have to list the naturally occurring chemicals in non-GMO produce. The public would see the arsenic, solanine, cyanide, and become terrified of fruit. Oxalic acid, for example, is found in buckwheat, spinach, sorrel, and rhubarb. Rhubarb recipes often warn readers to stay away from the leaves because they contain poisonous amounts of oxalic acid, but they never mention that rhubarb leaves taste terrible, which mitigates the danger of accidentally eating a dangerous amount of them. According to Bon Appetit, a 130-pound woman would need to eat 10 pounds of bitter rhubarb leaves to have an adverse reaction, which could include a burning mouth and throat, nausea and vomiting, diarrhea, cardiovascular failure, coma, and death. If we can't blame maraschino cherries for my aunt's cancer, what should we blame? TV waves, anxiety, rage? Years after she died tragically young, but not from eating processed food, I started a new July ritual. Make maraschino cherries the old-fashioned way, free of food coloring and calcium salts, preserved for cocktails year-round. I start with 4 or 5 pounds of fresh sour cherries and use a real cherry pitter, a contraption that screws onto a standard canning jar and catches the pits. My husband Sam and I drink Manhattans while we pit, served his favorite way. On the rocks with the previous year's maraschino cherries, never citrus. I combine the pitted cherries with a bottle of Luxardo maraschino liqueur and I heat them briefly because I read somewhere I'm supposed to do that. Then I seal them in jars with some of the pits to add a dash of benzaldehyde. Over the rest of July and part of August, the maraschino's candy red will fade to a serious mauve. That's how we know they're ready. Globes of liqueur-logged fruit that taste of what they once held safe at their centers. Summer glow and fair warning. True cherry and almost almond. Promise and poison from deep in their seeds.
Yay! You don't get to hear anyone clap.
I know.
They're all clapping. So thank you so much. So yeah, I know I can see little clap hands popping up on the screen. That's awesome. So listen, Kate, I thought maybe I'd ask you a few questions and we just sort of chat for the next little while, and people can put their questions in chat and we'll get to those after we're done with our conversation. So I just want everybody to know that how Kate and I are connected is that we share an editor who's here tonight. So I'm glad that she's here as well because she's the one who introduced us. And what we have in common, I think, are these, kind of these interests in plants and also in storytelling. So Wicked Plants, which is about deadly, dangerous plants, and Drunken Botanist, which is about the plants that we turn into alcohol. Like I feel like we have some plants that overlap for sure in this book. So that's so cool because they have a lot of interesting stories and a lot of kind of bigger meanings and bigger questions behind them, which I think is, sort of what you're doing with your book.
I love the way that you play with the form of a reference book with both of those books, how it's voicey, there's stories. You show us how kind of through like your lens, you show us what to be interested in, what is worth obsessing over with these plants. But you do it in this format that I think normally we would approach just to go get the information. And then you give us so much more. So I love that as a model for my own writing.
Well, yeah, I think that something that we think about as writers when we're writing in the third person is that even when you're writing in the third person, that's someone's voice. Like there always is a narrator, even if you're trying to pull yourself away as the narrator. So with Wicked Plants, I was, like I went and reread all the Lemony Snicket books as I was writing Wicked Plants, and I was looking at like Edward Gorey, and I wanted this sort of like delightfully creepy sort of voice, so that it sounded like it was coming from a person, even if it wasn't written in the first person and necessarily coming directly from me.
Yeah.
But that's really a thing. So I think that's really a thing with your books is I really, when I was sent the manuscript and I read it, I felt right away, for one thing, that like you're really a writer's writer. And I mean that in the best possible sense of the word. Like the people who I've heard from who are telling me about this book as if I didn't already know about it are like super geeky writer types who are interested in the language and like clever ways of putting stories together. And this book is so much of that. And it's this sense of like you're writing about one thing, but you're really writing about another thing. And like writers really respond to that. I think it's so interesting. So I wanted to tell you this little story and then get your reaction. So when I was in college, I was in Austin and I read the Austin Chronicle, which is the alternative weekly paper. And there's this guy writing for the Austin Chronicle under the name Petaluma Pete. And he was writing a food column, but it was really mostly about his crazy, dramatic, messed up life. But it was also about food. And I remember as like a 20-year-old reading this and going, you can do this? Like you can write about food, but you're really writing about something else? Like that's allowed? And then right before I left Austin, it turns out Petaluma Pete was a pseudonym. Like, believe it or not, his mother did not name him Petaluma Pete. And it was actually written by Ed Ward, who was the Austin Chronicle's rock critic and went on to become Fresh Air's rock critic. But that insight is what really, like, that is what started to interest me. Like I can write about these things, but I'm writing about that and I'm writing about something else. It's this idea of like a great essay is about 1.5 things. And so I just wondered, can you talk about that? Like this sense of like, I'm writing about one thing, but I'm writing about this other thing.
Sure. Gosh, I was thinking about my version of that story would probably be, I was house sitting for someone and they had a copy of Outlaw Cook. I cannot remember the author's name. I think it's like John Thorne. Does it sound familiar at all? At all? And in the introduction, and it was a compilation of newsletters that he had written, I think in the 80s and the 90s, and it had kind of turned into a book. But within the introduction, he talked about how in each food story, really what he's trying to figure out is how the food wants to kill its father and fuck its mother, which is right, of course, a grand Greek dramatic way of thinking about how do I use, something that seems everyday, prosaic, accessible, and not literary to tell grand stories. And I don't know, that seems also like something that's really important about a lot of food writing that I love too, is the way that it can get obsessed about one detail and spin just an entire web, not just of memory, but of something with, historical significance as well, like a essay like, it's MFK Fisher's The Measure of My Powers, and it starts, the first thing I remember wanting to, or the first thing I ever tasted and remember wanting to taste again was, she goes on to describe the like kind of pinkish gray foam off a pot of strawberry jam. Right. But that whole piece culminates in this incredible image of her grandmother alone in the kitchen, having kicked everyone out because they're all incompetent compared to her. Incredibly powerful. She looks like this kind of high priestess surrounded by billows of steam and smoke. Right. And it struck me reading that this image of power of her within her kitchen would have occurred before women had the right to vote. The minute she stepped out of that kitchen, she would have lost a lot of that power. And none of that's said in that essay, but MFK Fisher gets to it through the foam on the top of some strawberry jam. So yeah, moments like that made me realize, like, oh, food, I can write in a practical way about what to do with a bunch of sour cherries. And while I do that, let the kind of physical and culinary qualities of this fruit lead me to larger stories, personal stories, historical stories, medical stories, all that. Just see where it goes.
Well, and also I think with this book, I mean, I think it's so great the way food writers especially continue to push against the boundaries of what can food writing be and all the different ways that that's possible. But I think what's so interesting about how you did it is this sense of danger. I feel like there's this I mean, not only with talking about, say, a poison that might be in a plant, but even undercurrents of danger and fear and threats in the personal stories as well. So like thematically, were you, I mean, I was gonna ask you thematically, like, how did you choose the plants? So like for me, I had to figure out what is a working definition of a wicked plant? Like, how do I know which ones to leave in and which ones to leave out? And with Drunken Botanist, like, what am I gonna leave in and what am I gonna, what's my own writer's criteria with that? But then, so I wanna hear about that, but also with personal stories, like, thematically and this sense of danger or difficulty, like how are you making those choices, I guess?
How that arose. I think both those questions are so intertwined. I will probably have to answer them together, because what arose for me, I mean, I chose my fruits in some ways according to whether or not I kept coming across them. Or if somebody suggested them to me and something about them sparked my interest. But often they would spark my interest because they would have that element of pleasure and poison. I think, one of the early chapters that I wrote was about huckleberries. This really kind of helped me understand the formal approach of the book, actually. And that's a fruit that's native to where I live in Spokane, Washington. It's a fruit that is prized by everyone who lives here. So it's sacred to the indigenous tribes here, who go out and pick it every year. It's incredibly expensive. You can buy it at, Huckleberries, the nice grocery store that's 10 blocks from my house, for something like $90 a gallon. The way that this fruit could be both completely free and incredibly expensive, could be, a sacred fruit to the tribes of my area, but then also really valued by the descendants of colonizers, by the new people. I wanted to find a way that all of these qualities could exist within, one essay, one room of the book, I guess. And that it had both of those qualities made it possible for me to write about. But then when it comes to kind of food and poison, or food and medicine, I think I've really grown up with a sense of food being able to heal you if you make the right food choices. But related to that is always the inability to make the right food choices, because the right food choices don't taste very good. What heals is also what you have to choke down. That's, the very first fruit that I wrote about, aronia, its folk name is chokeberry, because that's what you do when you try to eat it. And I was really curious about that sense of how or why I had a sense that if it was difficult, if it didn't taste good, it was better for me in some way. I wanted to understand kind of the magical thinking that I had around what foods would heal me and what would not heal me.
Mhm.
So that's another way that I made those choices.
And they're not all fruits.
No.
Botanically speaking, which is, you know, like, that's the funny thing, right? Like you create a box and then you sort of, but like I included some fungus in wicked plants. I thought they're never going to let me write wicked fungus, so I'm going to put them in here. And you kind of did the same thing.
Maybe freaky fungus. They would let you write. Yeah, no, and that also came about in part because every time I started a new chapter, I felt like I'd have to start completely over and relearn how to write the essay and relearn how to write this book. And I think the first time I wrote a chapter that wasn't about a fruit was my face clock chapter. And face clock is a folk name for dandelion. And I ended up being able to break that rule of what a fruit was important. Well, first, making a rule that I was going to write about fruit gave me a nice little box to work within that allowed me to get started with writing. But then at some point, I had to get out, I guess, break my own rules in order to keep writing. So that's partly why I started writing that face clock chapter. But then the other was, I mean, I'm already in every single chapter using, you know, elements of the fruit itself as a metaphor for one thing or another. You know, why not start to make fruit its own metaphor? Say that. Then why couldn't dandelions be a fruit? As if I just kept stretching my imagination. I think to Jenna Johnson, our editor, this may have started to become a little bit of a snarl and perhaps a bit of a nightmare. I know that she kept being like, remember, like the fruit is at the center of it. I actually have, let me see if I can find this. This was something that she told me that I kept in front of me. Oh, I'll find it in a second.
Reading your editor's notes back to her.
Yeah, I hope you're blushing, Jenna.
They're engraved in our hard little hearts.
Oh. Nah, I can't find it right off the top of my head, but if I do, before we end, I'll show it to you. It's a nice little map of themes that we went over in the middle of writing the book, trying to kind of prune my imaginative flights into something that a bit more shapely.
Wow, I'd love to see a map. But so talk about the selection process with personal stories and like how you're, you know, like I think it would be easy to imagine sort of like a row of Post-its of fruit candidates and a row of Post-its of like personal narrative candidates and then a matchmaking game that happens. But I'm sure that it's a much more kind of organic and complex process than that.
Well, usually I couldn't write about a fruit unless I had some kind of personal narrative. And so the narrative would come, I guess the narrative, but they wouldn't come at the same time. Some of it had to do with just sitting down and failing, trying to write about a particular fruit that I had chosen, and then maybe alighting upon a story that could fit within this fruit. And then once I found that personal story, I had the chapter. Or it would start with a personal story, and that, for example, my wheat chapter, that was easy. That's a story about a past love I had. I was I still am an obsessive baker. And my ex had celiac disease, and you could see the writing on the wall, but we weren't quite ready to see that writing on the wall. And when I had visited the Mill City Museum in Minneapolis, and they had this really interesting graphic display about a mill explosion that had happened there in 1878. And on it, they were describing how the workers would be surrounded by flour dust, so that at the end of the day, they would have to comb the dough that had formed on their skin off. And the explosion itself had been caused by flour dust, which is incredibly flammable. It's even more flammable than gunpowder. So having that personal story in the background, we'd already broken up. It'd been a couple of years. I was still, nursing my broken heart or whatever, and trying to come up with, some good story to tell myself about why I was better. And then encountering that exhibit at the museum and these, really interesting graphic images and ideas about wheat, I guess, yeah, it comes together. Then I have a chapter.
Right. Yeah. And you sort of start collecting these little anecdotes and these little odd connections, like an odd historical story about a factory and how that connects to this plant, and then how do those things marry with the with a personal story, and I'm sure it takes a while for all of that to quite come together.
Yeah, and I'm really inspired by the kind of the scraps of language I find from other people. So that was part of my commonplace book for this book, was just writing down, if I found it, just anything, the more esoteric, the better, that had to do with a fruit that I was interested in, it would go in there and start to influence the direction of the essay. Oh, I found the chart that I was telling you about. Okay, so see if you can see this. In the middle, it says fruit. That's supposed to be the center. And then right around that is the difficulty. I can't even remember what's right around that. What did I write? I wrote types of difficulty: personal, medical, historical, botanical. So
Yeah.
I had this in front of me up on the wall to try to just keep myself focused.
Yes, that's good. That's a good little drawing to help navigate. And please, guys, put your questions in the chat, and we're going to get into that in a few minutes. Before we do, I also want to know, is there anything that got cut? And I would love to know what and why, if you can bear to talk about it.
Well, you mean besides the incredibly bad writing I did for part of
Yeah,
the book?
besides that, there are things that didn't make the cut because it's like it's too far afield, or it's too weird, or it's too, I don't know, dark or strange or personal, or what doesn't fit the brief, like anything like that.
There was, yeah, my original quince chapter had, which is a story I'm talking about, the way that this really fragrant, beautiful fruit tastes terrible raw if you're not prepared for it. It's very sour, it's very astringent. And some scholars think that it is the fruit of knowledge. So I started to think about quince. What kind of stories could I tell about that would be like this forbidden fruit of knowledge? I ended up telling a story about two aunts of mine whom I discovered their existence by going through my grandfather's thing and my grandparents' things when I was about 10 or 11 years old. We never talked about them. They were not, in the family. And that part of the story remains, but I think there was a bunch of other threads that I was trying to bring in about, I think, my grandmother's repression, my grandmother's sense of humor, her toughness, and kind of my own questions about kind of femininity and losing control of your femininity as you hit puberty and become this kind of dangerous, girl woman. That in my grandparents' case, they had two of those and they kicked him out of the house. And a lot of the more kind of grotesque parts that I was writing about in that ended up getting cut. It didn't. In some ways, one of the things I thought I needed to be careful about was I didn't want this book to be merely palatable, and that's my complaint with food writing, if I have one, is that it's just palatable. It's and I mean that literally, and then also as a metaphor, as a way to talk about the voice, and what the writer is willing or not willing to talk about. And that's why I wanted these, kind of tougher threads within that piece. But then I also, in the end, wanted to write these chapters about food that still made you want to eat the food. So it's trying to balance, I guess, some kind of personal body details with, wanting the reader to be able to turn the page and actually want to make that quince jelly.
Right. Well, I think it was E.B. White who said that the suspense in memoir or personal narrative is how honest is the writer really going to be? like how far are they really going to take us? And that's the question that keeps people reading when they're reading personal narratives. But at some point, you're making choices about what you want to reveal about yourself and your family and friends and other people in your lives. I mean, that's an issue that every memoirist and essayist grapples with, is how do I, if I put this down on paper, I gotta go face up to the person who's talked about here.
Mhm. And also, like, what truly fits within the form of the book,
Yeah.
within the rules that I've set out for myself. That was a question I had as I was choosing what to cut.
Yeah, you want it to hang together as a work of art, to seem cohesive and like I meant to do this, like I meant for it to be this way. And I think that's what readers, or for any kind of art, viewers, they will go there with you if it seems like you're in command of, I meant for it to feel like this.
I also love that moment in personal writing when I get the sense of the author's sense of their own bullshit. I always love those moments when the writer feels full of it and shows it.
And did you have that moment?
Oh, definitely. I hope I showed it. I tried. We'll see.
Right. Well, and I think that's a little bit of a thing too. With memoir, with any kind of first person narrative, you're in some ways inventing a version of yourself who's going to be the narrator of this book, who's different from your real self, your real schlubby self who sits around in their pajamas half the morning and is super boring. Like, you kind of gotta adjust the dials, turn the volume up and down on different parts of your personality or your inner being, to create something that can be put before people. You're making choices. Like when we write about ourselves, we're making choices about what to put out there. And that act of making choices is creating a different self that readers get, that's different from the self that like your best friend and your family know about you.
Definitely.
Yeah. And that's the fun part, I think.
Self.
What's that?
The made up self.
The made up self, yes. So I don't know, do you feel like, because as a reader, as someone who doesn't know you personally, like this book just feels so honest and open and real and kind of uncensored and like it's all there on the page, but you are making choices about what to leave in and what to leave out. So there's some part of yourself that's still yourself that's not on the page.
Definitely. Well, and some of, one of the main ways I make choices is also kind of on the sentence level. Like, do I have a sentence that sounds good? Not in a way that like I'm going to write something that's not true because it sounds good, but that there's got to be music in that line, and that's part of the way I'm constructing myself also, or constructing the voice.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I don't think I could tell you exactly how constructed I am in this book compared to this person right here. Someone else will have to tell me that.
Right. Yeah. Well, I also wanted to just talk a little bit more about the fruit in general. I know we've got a couple of questions that are specific to the fruit. So should we get into that?
Sure.
Maris, do you want to go through them, or would you like me to? How should we do it?
I'm happy to.
Okay.
Here's a question that I think you should both answer. Very easy starter question from Lindsay. What is your favorite pie?
Well, my specialty is double crust fruit pie. And I always answer this question that way rather than having to choose one particular fruit. Because I think that's one of the most brilliant food forms we've invented, is just take, fruit that's in season, wrap it in some delicious pastry. Don't do too much to mess it up. Just let it shine and eat it. But if you had to ask me right now, it's almost rhubarb season. So it'll be rhubarb, which isn't a fruit.
And yet it belongs. My favorite pie. So my grandmother was not one of these great cooks. She was definitely a grandmother of the prepared foods and frozen food aisle category. And she used to make this cherry pie, and I'm pretty sure she was using like frozen like croissant dough, like, or no, not frozen, but the kind that came in the can and you'd twist it and it would pop out. You know that? Remember those? Don't shake your head. Come on, really? Well,
I
anyway,
believe you. I believe you.
Pillsbury, very Pillsbury kind of
Yeah.
thing. And then the cherries were, I'm sure, just a bag of, or a can. They were probably just canned super sweet cherries, but somehow sour cream was involved. Yeah.
I've seen a version of this. There's a version of this in Joy of Cooking.
Okay, well, probably it's that, but then adapted in some magazine for like how to do this with sort of more instant foods. And I'd give anything to be able to go back in time and have that with her again.
Right.
Amazing. Here's a question from Elizabeth Reinecke. I am in the middle of trying to write my own interwoven essay collection and I'm so fascinated by this conversation and love the topics you're discussing. I'm super curious about whether or not there was pushback from editors and publishers, so maybe Jenna would like to also speak to this, about whether or not readers are interested in nonfiction or memoir stories like this. Another book like this that did really well is Book of Eels, but these seem like outliers, and I'm curious about any advice about your positioning your own books that you might be willing to share.
Thinking about positioning. I don't have any thoughts about positioning. I'm so sorry. I guess I'm thinking more about how exciting it is to find a book like the Book of Eels, or a book like Kate Zambrino's Heroines, for example. Like, these are books that weave many ways of knowing and many different kinds of writing in a way that I find really exciting. So I kind of set out to try to see what would happen if I did something similar. I hadn't seen that in food writing yet, and it seemed, like a ripe topic to try to weave all these different ways of knowing together. I don't know. Amy, what do you think?
I think for me, the books like this that stand out are the ones where the writing is just mind-blowingly good. Very poetic. I mean, when I said earlier that you're a writer's writer, that's kind of what I mean. Like writers love writers where you can really geek out on language, and you get to a sentence and you're like, oh man, I wish I'd thought of that. So I think that's what elevates it. And probably that's what editors fall in love with. They're like, I never thought I'd want to read a book that's about this thing and this other thing, but my God, this thing is just, it's such a pleasure to read. Like you never hit a dull moment. You never hit an awkward phrase. It's poetic. The language is very transcendent. And I think that's what elevates it. So that's easy, right? Like that's
I just write a good book.
Just better. I don't know.
Good luck.
Nancy has a couple of questions. Both of them are so great that we can get to both of them. Can you talk about this beautiful sentence that begins a note on recipes, Kate? Recipes are rituals that promise transformation.
That is something that I've been thinking about for, I guess, ever since I started cooking. I think I've wondered why I'm drawn back into the kitchen, why I would want to sink so much time into kind of what other people would think are rote, thankless tasks. And I ended up writing that line. I was sleepless. I think it was 4 a.m. I was trying to write this introduction. And I had been thinking about the ways that the recipes themselves and the head notes, like they kind of occur they're in like a different time signature than the other essays in the book. And I was trying to figure out, how do I capture, I guess, the feeling of kind of entering each of the rhythms of these head notes and recipes, but then also trying to define why they're worth entering, what draws us back over and over. And then that phrase arose.
Amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Terry asks, did you do research before you did your writing or as you were writing about each food?
Oh, both. So I would usually start when I had a vague idea about the fruit in general, and I wouldn't get very far. I'd get pretty stuck. I'd perhaps, write a bunch about myself, but that gets kind of boring. And I knew that once I got stuck, that was when it was time to go and do research, because that would fuel where the rest of the essay would go. And I would kind of then do enough research that I could put it down, and try to forget about it. Try to, I don't know, digest it, I guess you could say. And then I would try to write again. And then I'd have to keep going back and forth to my research then to make sure, after I've tried to get out of those more fact-based books and into my own style of writing, I would need to go back and make sure that I was factually correct, right? So it really was just this, I was just going around and around and around, to myself, to the books, to myself, to the books. And at the time, I'm just finishing up this job right now. I was worked for WSU, Washington State University's Health Sciences Library. So I had access to at WSU's gigantic archive of everything. And that became an amazing, cabinet of wonders to peer into every time I got stuck.
Do you see Jenna's comment, Amy, that this seems like a great question for Amy too? She has amazing note organizing system.
They have evolved over many books, but yeah, I'm super geeky about it now. I use Evernote, and everything is digitized, and everything's indexed, and everything goes into Evernote as soon as it comes to me. Like, I don't let it pile up. So like with my historical fiction, with the Kopp sisters novels, I mean, I have thousands and thousands and thousands of documents and newspaper clippings and little genealogical things, and they're all in there. It sounds meticulous and time consuming, but it's actually stupidly crazy easy. I think what's happened, technology's gotten so much better that everything's sort of full text searchable. So you no longer have to do a lot of meticulous indexing. Stuff will come up in search, and photographs are searchable by image. So, I can just search for cat, and it just sort of knows what thing. It's like, here's a bunch of pictures of cats, and sometimes a couple of chickens too. Like, it doesn't always get it quite right. It's like, this looks kind of like a cat, but it could be a throw pillow. But, like, there's the technology has gotten so much better that you can sort of throw all your notes and all your weird stuff in there and trust that you'll be able to pull it back out again when you need it. So it feels very creative. It does not feel like secretarial work. It feels like part of the creative process. It's good.
Amazing. A final question from Nancy says, can you talk about how you chose the recipes that appear in the book?
Well, I am also, I want to say quickly, so glad that Jenna held me to stick to the 2 recipes that I had promised when I made the book proposal. Because about halfway through, I realized, like, holy shit, I basically have promised to write a book of essays and a cookbook, and I'm going to mash them together. And this is 2 books at once. How am I going to do this? And I tried to back out of it, and she's like, no, this is necessary. And she was absolutely right. This is necessary. And the way that I chose them often had to do with, first I was thinking of them as illustrations of the essays. So I wanted to, if at all possible, make a recipe that I mentioned in the essay, or in somehow just captured whatever the themes of the essay were. I also started to think about trying to represent as many food forms as possible, because I realized one of the things that kind of filled me with wonder is all the kind of categories of cooking fruit can fit into. And I don't think I didn't represent all of them, but I got a good collection of them within the book. And then finally, they had to taste good, if at all possible, right? So like medlar is a good example. That is an incredibly cool fruit that isn't ripe until it's rotten. The fruit itself is not that delicious, I think. I mean, since saying that in public, I've been hearing from medlar lovers around the world who, are like, I'm not sure what you're talking about. It's the most amazing fruit, which is great. Actually, these are the kind of nerds I would love to talk to. But I did not like this fruit. And so you'll see in one of the head notes, all the different ways I tried to make it into something delicious. And finally, I discovered after much, much failure, that if you boil the hell out of this fruit, the water that produces, the essence, we'll call it, so that it sounds a little bit more delectable, is amazing. It tastes amazing. It smells amazing. So a lot of experimentation and failure and taste tests. That's how I decided what became a recipe.
Love that. Kate and Amy, thank you for just a really fascinating and charming conversation. And thanks to all of you who came to watch. The Book of Difficult Fruit is available for purchase at McNally Jackson. Links in the chat. And thank you all.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And thanks to McNally Jackson. I just want to say real quick, you know, I live all the way across the country, and yet there have been many times when I've walked into McNally Jackson and found the book that has unlocked all the problems I was having with the book I was writing, or just a book that I have kept with me all these years and always tell people about. There's something very special about McNally Jackson, and I cannot wait to set foot in there again. But please, guys, buy some books from them. It's the one and only way that bookstores stay alive, is if you buy books there. Loving them is not enough. So buy something from McNally Jackson, please.
Well said.
Good night.
All right.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.